Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the 4 elements to rich text editing success in a CMS. I'm joined with Frederick Danielson, the product manager of TinyMCE, and I'm John, marketing manager at TinyMCE. In this session, we're going to talk about what you need to start thinking about when you're developing a rich text editing experience within your CMS. You might find this content useful if you're building a new CMS or if you're upgrading rich text editing within your existing CMS. TinyMCE got its start with content management systems, and now it's used to power over 40% of the web's content. We've seen a lot of implementations of rich text editing within CMSs, so that's why we wanted to put this content together to help you in your journey. So we'll cover the 4 key elements, but first I'm going to hand it over to Frederick to describe some of the personas that you'll be dealing with as you're building your CMS and the rich text editing experience within it. Over to you, Frederick.
All right, thank you, John. So when you plan your CMS, you should account for the following 3 personas. You have your developers, your content administrators, and your content creators. For your developers, you want to focus on the user experience, making the editor fit into the app, and you focus on the compatibility and the output, for example, CEO, responsive stuff, and stuff similar. On the other hand, you have the content creators, where you have to balance how expressive you want the content to be about productivity and collaboration. And finally, you have the content administrators in the middle here, where you have to make sure that the focus is on quality, on consistency, and compliance. So everything looks the same, it works the same, and it's on brand all the time. So let's start looking at number 1.
Okay, so it seems like a given, but of course you want to make sure that you have the right UI for the job. Now, yes, we're talking about the UI matching and feeling the look and feel of the overall CMS, but we're also talking about the tools, the buttons that you give your content creators to create their content. So for example, if you don't want your content creators creating red text underlined with yellow highlight, don't give them those options in the UI. And then, of course, you also want people who have higher level roles to have different permissions. So take the example that Frederick was talking about earlier with the content administrator. You might have a content creator who doesn't have much of a technical skill set and just wants to get in there and create and build and express themselves. But then as you move up to the content administrator's role, for example, an editorial manager, they may want to be able to go in there and tweak that content creator's content with a bit more ability to change it beyond the basic editing. So for example, your content administrator may be familiar with some basic HTML. They may benefit from an HTML code editor within their rich text editing experience to go in and tweak some of the nuts and bolts of the content. Okay, lastly, you want to think about internationalization. So if you're a company with offices around the world, chances are you have staff that work in different languages. If your CMS is being offered in those languages, make sure that the rich text editing component within your CMS is able to offer the buttons, the tooltips within those languages as well. And are the translations available? Ask yourself that. Will I have to do my own translations? Or am I using a rich text editing solution that already has some pre-done translations? So before we move on to number 2, we're going to take a quick look at some popular CMSs out there and see how their UIs work in the rich text editing experience. All right, the first one here we have is Joomla, which uses TinyMCE. So Joomla is a very extensible, highly customizable CMS that developers can use to create pretty much whatever they want. So it makes sense that Joomla has a really advanced rich text editing experience. Now, moving over to Shopify. Shopify is an e-commerce CMS. E-commerce CMSs often have product pages, and within those product pages, there's various sections of content that have their own fields. So what we're looking at here is the product editor for Shopify. Shopify lets you input the title in plain text, but then for the product description, it's in rich text. What they've done is they've included a very simplified version of TinyMCE here to enable them to have better control over the output of what's shown on the front end of the product page. They obviously don't want people creating their own sort of Picasso work of art within the product description. It's meant to be more simple, more basic. And then lastly, we have a really interesting implementation of TinyMCE with HubSpot's landing page builder. What they've done is they've built their own sort of drag and drop builder with different modules. And when you select a module, it shows controls related to editing that module. When you select a rich text module, TinyMCE's toolbar drops down up here, customized to the HubSpot UI with just the functionality that they want. Awesome. So Frederick, I'm going to hand it over to you for principle number 2.
Thank you, John. So number 2 is getting control over the output. This means the HTML that you output from the editor, that you have your tags, your classes, your attributes, that they are SEO friendly, responsive, works with mobile, that everything is accessible, and that it is compliant with the style guide of your brand and the design system you may use. So with TinyMC, we designed a lot of options to be able to control exactly which tags are allowed and aren't allowed, what attributes you can put on these tags, what classes are allowed. And we have built tools to help with accessibility checking and spell checking and link checking and all that. So the authors has full control over the output of the content, and yeah, it's all compliant basically. So next topic, over to you, John.
Thanks, Frederick. Okay, so number 3 is make sure that your rich text editing experience is tightly integrated with your CMS. So this can take a number of forms. Number 1, media management. So your chances are, if you're running a CMS, your content creators are going to want to add video, they're going to want to add images, but all of that has to be stored somewhere. It has to be stored on your CMS or somewhere else. So just make sure when you're creating a rich text editing experience that you've thought about that. How is my rich text editor going to handle media? How is it going to interact with my CMS when it comes to media? Next, think about, is my CMS going to offer any dynamic or predefined assets? So when we're talking about that, we mean like related content, for example. Maybe you're running a newspaper and the digital edition has a widget that you can add that says related content, and it's automatically generated with today's headlines. So if you want your content creators to add that, you need to start thinking, what's that going to feel like for my content creators, and how will that dynamic content plug into my CMS, and where's it going to come from? There's also predefined assets. So with more corporate websites, you may want to control your brand a bit more with boilerplate legal text or boilerplate company text. So again, start thinking about, how do I want to enable my content creators to include this content without maybe them editing it? And then beyond that, some people who are creating CMSs want to customize rich text editors beyond what comes out of the box. So if you think that you're going to be creating some really specific functionality for your rich text editing experience and you're using a pre-made rich text editor, think about, does this rich text editor have APIs or other ways to interact with it so that I can extend the functionality easily? And then lastly, as you're building your CMS, you're probably using some sort of development framework. So just think about, does my rich text editing solution easily integrate with this framework, or is it going to be a lot of work to make them all work together? Some rich text editors like TinyMCE come with integrations that plug right into your app development framework. For example, if you're writing your app in React, TinyMCE has a React integration to make it really easy to include it in your project. One great example of tight integration with the CMS is Joomla. So they've added some custom functionality here to add content from other places in the CMS. So for example, if you wanted to add a module from Joomla, for example, breadcrumbs, they let you add it really easily through that menu. Okay, on to number 4, and that is create a predictable experience. So this one seems really simple. It seems like a no-brainer, but it's often overlooked. So number 1, make sure that the user experience is predictable and familiar. Don't reinvent the rich text editing wheel. There's been a lot of work done over the years to think about what some of the best practices are with rich text editing, how things should be laid out. Unless you have a really, really great idea about how you can do it better, chances are you're best sort of starting off with what already exists and then maybe building on top of that. Another thing to think about to make sure that your content creators have a smooth experience is the copy and paste experience. So quite often content creators are amalgamating content from different sources, for example, other websites or Word docs or email. and you want to think about if they were to copy a more complex section of a word processing document over, how would that copy over to my rich text editor? Would it copy over exactly as it is within that word processor, or would the rich text editor apply certain stylings to it? It's just something to start thinking about. And as you're doing this, test out different rich text editors, test them out, see how they work with those use cases. It's something that's often overlooked and caught later on in the process. So the earlier you can look at this, the better. And then lastly, make sure that your features meet the expectations of your users. So on the same topic of word processing, if you find your users constantly creating content outside of your CMS in other tools, ask yourself why. What's missing in my CMS rich text editing experience that is making them start creating content in other places, other tools? And then think about, can I add those functionalities to my rich text editor? Maybe they want collaboration features like commenting. Think about how you can tailor the features to the expectations that your users have. So, quick recap. The right UI for the job, control over the output, tight integration, and a predictable experience. So just before we close off, I'll share something we've been working on over here at TinyMCE. We put together a CMS starter config to help you get started with rich text editing within your CMS. It has all the popular features that any CMS would start off with, and it's super easy to get started with. All you have to do is head over to the URL on this screen, which I'll also pop into the description, and try out the config for yourself. You can also sign up for a 14-day free trial of the premium features, which are included in the CMS, to see the full capabilities of the starter config. Okay, so hopefully this video was useful and you're on the right track to building a rich text editing experience within your CMS. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the comments. Good luck!